And so when I knew Yves was coming, I took out a couple of his books, and I had trouble reading them because I always thought we were the good guys out there, and I know a lot of the stuff that's going on that's not so good, but I didn't know how bad Lester Pearson was. I didn't know that we really were in Iraq, contrary to what our beloved Premier Craig Chan told us, or Prime Minister Craig Chan told us at the time. So I've been reading Stop Science, which is fascinating, and the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. This was hard to read, because it really did stop me a few times and thought, I didn't know that, and I thought I was fairly aware of how bad we were. I knew about the mining, I knew about a lot of the things, but I didn't know how bad Pearson was, and I didn't know many of the things that are in here. So I really appreciate the fact that Yves is bringing us up to date, and that we really do need to focus in on what's wrong with this government and how maybe we can change it, as opposed to just worrying about Mr. Trump. So on that, I'd like to introduce Yves Engler.
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks to the council for putting this on, and thanks everyone for coming out. This is part of the getting towards the end of the tour for a propaganda system, how Canada's government, corporations, media, and academia sell war and exploitation, which is basically a book about information dissemination and suppression in Canadian foreign policy. So my 6 previous books about Canadian foreign policy deal with subject areas, Canada and Africa, about Canada's role in conquering Africa in the late 1800s, onwards up to today, Canada-Israel, of course, dealing with Canada's support for dispossession of Palestinians, etc. And basically the book's trying to answer the question of why do 9 in 10 Canadians think this country is a force for good in the world, despite a long history of supporting empire, British, today US, and advancing Canadian corporate interests abroad. That is, in a nutshell, what Canadian foreign policy has been about. But yet, overwhelmingly, we think this country is a force for good. So basically, why are we so confused about our country's place in the world? And the first question I have for you is how many people think this book is going to be reviewed by the Globe and Mail, by the Toronto Star, or others? So we have some cynics. Yes, it is unlikely that it will be reviewed. My previous books, I've found there's very little space in the dominant media in this country to deal with my subject matter in my previous books. So there's even less likelihood that they're willing to review something that criticizes the media in the nefarious Canadian foreign policy. But yeah, so my experience writing books is that I've had almost no corporate media attention. The Canada and Haiti book back in 2005, it was mentioned in a column in the Toronto Star, and then 5 years later, after there was the earthquake in Haiti, it got 15 words in the book section of the Globe Mail, I believe. The ugly Canadian Stephen Harper's foreign policy was mentioned in a Toronto Star column. Canada and Israel building apartheid, it was reviewed only by one paper, by the London Free Press, by a sympathetic professor at Western University. The next week there was a counter review of the book, a whole 750 words. I've never actually seen a counter review, a full response taking a different perspective of the book. By an unreview, yeah, we're going to take that back. By a pro-Israel organization, Honest Reporting Canada. With the exception of the Halifax Chronicle Herald, which has reviewed a couple of my books sympathetically, the only review of one of my books by a major paper is the Montreal Gazette. I live in Montreal, and I'd been hassling the Gazette book editor to review the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. Once the book was shortlisted for the Quebec Writers Federation's Nonfiction Award, they finally said, okay, we'll review it. This is part of what the reviewer had to say. Readers who haven't spent their formative years having Marxism-Leninism hammered into their heads might find Engler's approach very refreshing. It transported me back to my days as a university student in the Soviet Union to a pre-perestroika class in Marxist-Leninist political economics. So it, of course, was a highly dismissive review, but because any attention is better than no attention, I got on the phone emailed all the book editors at Can West Papers across the country to tell them that this review was in their system and could they please run it in their paper. And I think I got a few of them to do that. So my experience writing critical op-eds about Canadian foreign policy is actually is similar to my experience with books. So I've published or submitted dozens and dozens of op-eds critical of different elements of Canadian foreign policy over the past 12 years or so to major papers in the country, and I believe I've had 4 of those op-eds published. And I know what people are thinking right now. They're like, this guy can't write, he doesn't know anything, maybe thinking about the exit. But in fact, my experience writing about domestic issues is different. In the early 2000s, when I was getting politicized, when I was starting to write, I submitted maybe about a dozen op-eds about domestic issues, critical of different domestic issues. I got about 6 of those published. More recently, I worked as a researcher for the Communications Energy Paperworkers Union, and one of the things I did is I wrote op-eds on behalf of the President of the Union. Submitted about a dozen op-eds, pretty much got all published. Of course, they were coming with the institutional heft of the union under the name of the President of the Union, so there was a different dynamic, but those were all critical about domestic issues. And some of them pushing the bounds. I mean, some of them, one of them at least was calling for economic democracy, directly challenging capitalism. In saying this, I'm not trying to say that there isn't a bias in favor of the corporate perspective or the elite perspective on domestic issues. There definitely is. That bias is significantly more stark on foreign policy issues. The range of debate that's allowed in the dominant media in this country on foreign policy issues is incredibly narrow. And my experiences point to that. One example I said in the book, among many, is last year, in the lead up to the launch of the Canada and Africa 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation book, the launch in Saskatoon, I submitted an op-ed to the Saskatoon Star Phoenix about the role of Potash Corps, which is based in Saskatoon, their role in exploiting the non-renewable resources of the last remaining colony in Africa, Western Sahara, in contravention of international law. So basically, Potash Corps is an agreement with the state-owned company owned by the Moroccan king, which is the occupying power in Western Sahara, in taking their resources. Submitted this to the op-eds editor at the Star Phoenix, who I had interacted with when working for a union for the CEP, and they published a couple of the op-eds during the time of CEP. The response from the editor at the Star Phoenix was to say, quote, "This issue has been on our pages in the past, with both sides of the debate making their points." That was kind of surprising because I was following the issue and hadn't seen much about it. So I did a search of the Star Phoenix database. What I found was that 2.5 years earlier, there was a 264-word letter to the editor criticizing Potash Corps' role in Western Sahara and a rebuttal from a company spokesperson. But from the op-ed editor, the whole story had been told. We gave a whole 264 words. Let's move on to more important issues like maybe what Kim Kardashian is up to or something like that. Another example, recent example, last year, personal example of experiencing the bias in major media on foreign policy issues is that I blog for the Huffington Post, which is really not a very glamorous thing because they don't pay you and they make you do all the work, make you put in links to all your statistics and whatever. So they basically, their model is to offload all the work onto the unpaid bloggers or journalists or whatever. But they do reach a bit of a different audience than the usual left-wing places I publish, so sometimes I take the time to submit there. I've basically come to the conclusion that the less interesting of an op-ed I submit, the more likely they are to publish it. Because the less controversial, the higher the likelihood. So there's many into the dozens now of op-eds they've refused to publish for what I deem to be political reasons. But in 2 occasions, they were very explicit about this matter. And on 2 occasions, they refused to allow me to mention the fact that Canadian government officials cited the responsibility to protect doctrine to justify overthrowing Haiti's elected government in 2004. People familiar with responsibility to protect? Most people? Okay. And so I submitted an op-ed. It had a paragraph citing the Canadian ambassador in Port-au-Prince invoking the responsibility to protect doctrine to justify Canada's intervention in Haiti in 2004, put a link to a article based upon an access to information request showing the ambassador citing the responsibility to protect. Also a link to another article, an interview between Anthony Fenton, the co-author of the Canada and Haiti book with me, and Denis Paradis, who was the minister responsible for the Haiti file around the time of the coup. Submit this to the Huffington Post. The Huffington Post editor responds by saying, quote, "We need mainstream sources to verify the facts in your blog, and unfortunately the facts below are only in the publications cited or printed elsewhere by the same authors." So basically the Huffington Post was taking the position that because it had not already appeared in the corporate media, it could not appear on their site, which, if you're challenging the dominant narrative of Canadian foreign policy, that makes the bar pretty high to achieve in terms of challenging. How many people in this room are familiar with something called the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti? Say anything to anyone? Basically, this was a meeting where the Canadian government brought together high-level officials from the Bush administration, from the Organization of American States, and a minister from the French government in 2003 to plot the ouster of the elected government in Haiti. They as reported on in L'Actualité, which is Quebec's equivalent to Maclean's magazine, on March 15th, 2003. At this meeting, just outside Ottawa, they decided that Aristide, the elected president, must go. Haiti should be put under UN trusteeship, and the Haitian military should be recreated. 13 months later, Aristide is ousted in a US, France, Canada coup. Haiti's been essentially under UN occupation since that time, and the Haitian military has been sort of partially recreated. So what was reported on by L'Actualité of the year before the coup all transpires. Okay? And so this is what happened in this Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. And the coup, of course, leads to thousands of people being killed in post-coup violence. One would think that this Ottawa Initiative on Haiti meeting, which again, there's information in the public record, you can find a Wikipedia page about it, Haiti solidarity activists discussed it dozens and dozens and dozens of times at different meetings across the country. You would think this meeting was of some news relevance. I did a Canadian newsstand search of major daily newspapers in this country for Ottawa Initiative on Haiti, and there is not a single mention by an English language corporate reporter of that meeting. There's a few mentions by Haiti solidarity activists. Not even mention, let alone a investigative, piece that delves into the subject in a serious way. Another more recent example of bias in the dominant media on foreign policy issues, the Green Party in August passed a resolution in support of calling for a divestment, boycott, and sanctions on Israeli institutions profiting from the occupation. According to Canadaland, the media watchdog group in Toronto, they searched a couple dozen articles about this resolution after it was passed. They didn't find one of those articles that cited a proponent of the resolution. So even though more than 2/3 of members at the convention in Ottawa supported the resolution and strong majorities in an online poll before the convention, all the news stories about this resolution passing were critics within the party or outside the party, people like the Israeli ambassador, criticizing the issue. And I just did a few events with Dimitri Lascaris, who is the author of this resolution, and he talks about how he gave an extensive interview to Globe and Mail reporter about the resolution. None of what he told the reporter appears in the paper the next day. Over the past decade, the Canadian government has signed about 10 foreign investment promotion and protection agreements with African governments. Basically, what a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement, or FIPA, is it's a tool that gives multinational corporations the ability to sue governments in international tribunals. So it supersedes state sovereignty in that way, or undermines democracy, if you like, in that way. Also, they're locked in for 16 years. So if one government signs a FIPA, future governments are beholden on that agreement. And basically what these FIPAs that Canada signed with African governments are all about is protecting Canadian mining interests on the continent, right? Canadian mining companies dominate all across the African continent. about $30 billion in Canadian mining investment in Africa. And there's a great number of conflicts between Canadian mining companies and local communities. And basically the mining companies like to have this added leverage over governments that if you, concede to, local pressure to, shut down our mine or nationalize our mine or increase the royalty rates, we have this ability to sue you in international tribunal. That's really the objective of these FIPAs. I did a search, could not find a single critical comment in a major English language media about any of the FIPAs that Canada signed with African government over the past decade. In April of 2015, the Harper government signed a FIPA with a caretaker government in Burkina Faso. So there was a popular revolt that ousted the 27-year regime of Blaise Compaoré, and there was an interim government supposed to be preparing the way for elections. The Harper government actually brought military officials from that interim government to Ottawa to sign this FIPA. This is a government that had no pretense of any electoral legitimacy, that's looking to lock in future governments for over a decade and a half. Incredibly undemocratic to do that, to sign a FIPA with the interim government. I write an op-ed about this, submitted it to major papers. Unsurprisingly, none of them are interested in the matter. So there is an extreme bias in favor of the state corporate perspective on foreign policy in the dominant media in this country, and I go through some of the explanations for that bias in terms of some of the structural explanations. Of course, most obviously, who owns the media. Canadian media is among the more concentrated in the world, at least among the wealthy countries. And I list examples of the owners of media outlets intervening in the newsroom to shape international coverage. The best known recent example is the case of the Asper family. When they set up the Can West papers, they intervened to make their papers even more anti-Palestinian than they already were. Another structural explanation is the revenue sources of media outlets. Mostly comes from advertising, which is from major corporations. And in the book, I go through some of the interests of the major advertisers in foreign policy. So one example is General Motors has been one of the largest advertisers in this country for probably about a century. And for much of that time, General Motors Defense was one of the biggest arms manufacturers in this country. So of course, General Motors had a certain interest in maintaining a major military budget, maintaining somewhat of an aggressive posture. So the interests of advertisers tend to seep into newsrooms. Another part of the structural explanation for the bias is that media outlets are dependent on other institutions for information, for news gathering. Major institution in foreign policy that they're dependent on is the military. Right? Military is this massive PR organization, which I'll get into in more detail later on. Also, very close ties with foreign affairs and their important role in being a source of information on foreign policy. Canadian media is also dependent on U.S. wire services for a whole lot of its international coverage. Associated Press, Washington Post, New York Times generally have a pro-U.S. slant in their coverage, so that also obviously seeps into the Canadian understanding of international affairs. And another structural explanation for the bias is that media outlets are responsive to pressure, like other institutions are. So when you or I write a letter to the editor, make a phone call, that can have an impact. It has a lot more impact when it comes from a powerful individual, and it has even more impact when it comes from a powerful institution. And in the book, I detail numerous examples of pro-military groups waging flat campaigns against media outlets when they're not happy with coverage. Pro-Israel groups waging flat campaigns against media outlets when they're not happy with coverage. The book also goes through some of the history, like the Canadian press, the establishment of the Canadian press, which was set up during World War I. With a major state subsidy, with the explicit motivation of bringing more pro-war coverage into Canadian media. And the Canadian press cemented itself as the leading wire service, the main wire service in the country during World War II, in part by working very closely with the military. So they had incredibly close ties with the military during World War II. And one example, a military PR official operating with a unit in Europe, one day he's under the Canadian military, the next day he's a reporter for Canadian Press with the same unit, right? So we're talking about incredibly close ties. Also, I go into the CBC, and in the early time of the CBC, they had very close ties to the Foreign Affairs establishment. There's a couple of master's or PhD theses that go into the CBC's ties to the Canadian military. And into the late 50s, they document examples of the CBC taking reports that they'd produced, passing them by military PR officials to see if it was okay to run those reports, right? So there's a long history of close ties. I don't think it's as close today as it was historically, but there still are some obvious structural explanations for the CBC's closeness to the Foreign Affairs establishment. The book goes through the history of information control during wars. Right? So during World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, there was formal censorship in this country. Korean War is slightly modified. During World War I, there was 253 news sources banned in this country. Different media outlets that were just shut down by the censor. The censor's office was going into record stores and taking records off the shelf that were deemed subversive. The censor also blocked books and movies that were available to the British public. Okay, so Canada, of course, was at war alongside Great Britain during World War I, but the British public was allowed to access certain information that the Canadian public was not allowed to access. And the censor's justification for blocking information available in Britain is quite interesting and relevant right up until today. So the censor basically said that people in Britain were closer to the action, had a greater sense that losing the war would have an impact on their lives. Canadians, more distant from the fight, our commitment to the war was based more upon idealistic sentiment than any sort of direct personal stake in the fight. And so in that context, it becomes more important to control what people are thinking or believing is going on, and more specifically that it's a morally righteous, morally just cause. And I believe that's still relevant right up to today, maybe probably even more relevant right up to today, where in most Canadian military missions or foreign missions, there's limited stake for most of the public in those missions. I was not going to be making a lot of money because Canadian fighter jets were bombing Libya, right? Maybe there's a handful of Canadian capitalists that were making a lot of money from that, but most of the public had very limited personal stake. So our support for that mission becomes based upon whether we think it's the right thing to do. And so then, of course, controlling information, what people know and think about it, becomes that much more important. I go through the different strategies from the military in terms of information control during different types of wars, recent wars. So in the case of bombing campaigns that Canada's been involved with, I'm talking about Iraq in the early 90s, former Yugoslavia, late 90s, Libya, 2011, Iraq, Syria more recently. The military has tried to exclude reporters, not allowed reporters to interview the pilots engaged in those bombing campaigns. And the rationale for doing this is quite interesting. They basically say that they're worried about the impact, potential security threat on the pilots' families back at home. So if their name appears in the paper, then they will be, their family members might be targeted by, and it traces this back to this claim during the 1991 Iraq War, where there was supposedly body bags put on the lawn of a Canadian pilot. It's almost for sure untrue, and I go into it in the book. But basically, the military tries to, on the bombing campaigns, they tried to really push the media out. And the reason for that is that it's very difficult to know what's going on at 25,000 feet, right? Reporters, media are very much dependent on those who are up there engaged in it, or the military to, in one way or another, release information. And the military on those campaigns has just chosen to their tactic is to really just kind of push media out. They took a completely different position on Canada's main ground campaign, right, in Afghanistan. In the case of Afghanistan, which actually was a more controversial mission, so you would think that the names of soldiers appearing in the paper would be more threatening or dangerous, the total opposite position. In that case, the military basically tried to bring reporters as close as possible. Had them stay on the bases, had them go out alongside with Canadian troops in the light armored vehicles, in the tanks that went on operations. That was, of course, the embedding program that people, I'm sure, heard about or familiar with. And this is how Scott Taylor, Canadian military reporter, described the embedding campaign in Afghanistan. He said, "What would you say if the Romanian military occupied your town and a Romanian tank and journalist showed up at your door? You love the government they have installed and want these guys to stay. Of course, the locals are smiling when a reporter shows up with an armored vehicle and an armed patrol." Yeah, it's not that surprising, but we never heard that the embedding campaign described like that. But Globe Mail didn't describe what they were doing in that kind of context. And none of this is haphazard, right? The military is the largest PR organization in this country. Right? They spend significant resources thinking through the different types of strategies of controlling information during different types of wars, right? With changes of technology, what they can get away with, etc. It's a massive PR organization, the military, but as part of their PR effort, they obscure the scope of their PR effort. So we don't know exactly how big their PR operations are, but we do have a certain sense, and most of this information comes from access to information documents that Embassy Magazine has requested. So in 2010, the military spent $354 million on PR and war commemorations. They devoted 661 staff. According to an internal Department of National Defense document, they have, quote, over 13 independent public affairs organizations operating within the ministry/military, presumably all dealing with different elements of the PR battle. Online, one can find contacts for 50 different media relations offices in the country. The military monitored 29,519 newspaper articles in 2012. They compile information, what they've released to different reporters, what reporters have reported on. So who's sympathetic, who should we release information to? They publish they have dozens of publications. They spend 10 to 20 million a year on recruitment. They spend, oftentimes, the military and other ministries spend 10, 20 plus million commemorating specific wars. They have major cultural outreach programs. You see soldiers at Canada Day festivities, Santa Claus parades, NHL games, air shows, on and on and on. So, in terms of traditional PR, working with major media institutions, the military spends significant resources, devotes significant energy to that. In terms of cultural outreach, they also spend significant resources on that. But it goes way beyond that. So the military has a history department with 50 employees, which is, I don't know this for sure, but I would say it's probably as big as most of the major Canadian universities' history departments. In that sort of ballpark, at least. The military's history department has been around for a century. Early on, into the 50s, 60s, they published most of the books about Canadian warfare were being published by the history department. Those books actually had to be given the okay, the defense minister had to give the okay. There's instances where those books were debated in cabinet, where cabinet actually said, okay, we want to take that out of the book. Okay. The military's had influence with the academic discussion of Canadian war by producing many of the books, but also because many of the early Canadian academics dealing with war-related issues began with the military history department. And that continues today. It's not as extreme, but there's still a great deal of influence from military historians of the Department of National Defense in the academic world. The military, of course, also has its own university, the Royal Military College, where the Defense Minister is Chancellor. The military has numerous, what I describe as arm's-length organizations, groups like the Royal Canadian Military Institute, the Legion, Conference of Defense Associations, Canadian Global Affairs Institute, Canadian Institute for Strategic Studies. All these organizations have either a financial, political, or other form of dependence on the military. They often also receive funds from arms manufacturers as well. And when you pick up the paper or watch TV news, a high proportion of the stories on military affairs, they quote individuals from one of these arm's-length military organizations. The military also has a direct avenue into Canadian universities, something called the Security Defense Forum, which was set up in 1967, established a number of the, financed the establishment of a number of the security studies programs at Canadian universities. They fund about a dozen security studies programs at Canadian universities. Beyond the military, if you start looking at the role of wealthy individuals, corporations, or the Saudi king in funding Canadian university programs associated with international affairs, it's amazing. It's amazing how many of them are funded by those people. So the Saudi king gave $5.3 million in 2010 to University of Toronto to set up the Chair for Dialogue Among Civilizations. In 2012, Qatar gave McGill's Institute of Islamic Studies $1.25 million. That year, David Azrieli gave Concordia $5 million to set up the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. David Azrieli is somebody who fought with the Haganah in 1948 in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Gerald Steinberg, a noted anti-Palestinian, described the donation to Concordia as a, quote, counterattack against Palestinian solidarity activism at that university. The same thing goes with the Israel studies at U of T and the University of Calgary, also both set up by prominent Zionists. The oldest school of global affairs in this country, the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, was set up with a major donation from Norman Paterson, who was a Liberal Party senator, somebody who was very close to Lester Pearson. Lester Pearson, of course, is the lead architect of post-World War II Canadian foreign policy, and he's well perceived, but let's just say there's a whole other side to Lester Pearson. Anyways, the Norman Paterson School has very close ties to external affairs right since the get-go. So the initial head of the Norman Paterson School was Norman Robertson, who was a top bureaucrat for a couple decades post-World War II. And Norman Robertson, while setting up the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, continued to be on contract from external affairs. And in the book, I detail the close ties, financial, significant donations from former foreign affairs officials to the Norman Paterson School. Many of the professors at Norman Paterson School today, they worked for foreign affairs, etc. The most influential school of global affairs in this country is the Munk School of Global Affairs. And is everyone familiar with Peter Munk?
Yeah, he was a Pinochet fan.
He was a Pinochet fan, yes, among others. Among other right-wing views. So Peter Munk was the founder of Barrick Gold, right? He was the largest gold mining company in the world. Very controversial company. And Peter Munk, among 35 million Canadians, he is probably, a couple handfuls of the least credible individuals to provide support for a study of international affairs. Okay, so he is somebody who's had a major personal self-interest in a particular type of Canadian foreign policy. His company has benefited from diplomatic support abroad, has benefited from Canadian aid, Export Development Canada support. His company has lobbied ferociously against any attempt to end public support for Canadian mining companies found to be engaged in major abuses abroad. Peter Munk is also an extreme right-wing ideologue who has gone on record saying Augusto Pinochet, the dictator in Chile, is a wonderful guy, saying that indigenous people around the world have way too many rights, saying that gang rape is a cultural habit in Papua New Guinea because his company security forces were engaged in gang rape, on and on and on. And a whole series of other issues he's on record saying really extreme stuff. Comparing Chavez to Hitler, all kinds of stuff. As part of his initial contract to set up, at that point, the Munk Center for International Studies in the late 90s at U of T, Munk put up $6.4 million and made it so the center had to receive advice from Barrick Gold's International Advisory Board. So this is a university academic department needing to receive advice from the International Advisory Board of a major corporation, which included on that advisory board our good friend George Bush Sr., the US President, head of the CIA, former head of the CIA, and also our good friend Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister of this country. And Munk also made it that he didn't put all his $6.4 million up right front. He made it in installments, meaning that he had leverage. He could withdraw his funding if he wasn't happy with the direction of the center. He was happy. He added another $5 million in 2006. And in 2010, Munk put up $35 million to set up the Munk School of Global Affairs. And if anyone's been down to the U of T's campus, it's a nice old building right on Bloor Street. And as part of his 2010 contract, he had the university commit $39 million from its endowment. He also got the Ontario and federal government to commit $50 million combined. Plus, he receives a tax credit of about $16 million for his $35 million donation. So effectively, he's putting up $19 million to mobilize about $100 million of mostly public funds for a school that he's had a whole lot of influence over the direction of. And the Munk School has of course, expressed a very establishment kind of foreign policy outlook. It joined the Harper government's low-level war against Iran. So in 2012, Foreign Affairs actually gave the Munk School $250,000 to engage in, like, quite explicitly, regime change efforts in Iran. Again, this is an academic department having the foreign minister come in to organize a conference to really to push regime change, and they weren't hiding this really. The Munk Center Munk School has also worked to undermine efforts to end public support for Canadian mining companies engaged in abuses abroad. And the Munk School has been highly influential. So, first of all, because it has a whole lot of resources. Secondly, it's in the media capital of the country, right? It's downtown Toronto. And people have obviously seen Janice Gross-Stein, who was the longtime head of Munk Center. She was always on CBC as one of the talking heads. They also have close ties to the Globe and Mail. So when the former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail stepped down about a year ago, 2 or 3 days later, position at the Munk Center. Previous editor-in-chief for the Globe and Mail, position at the Munk Center. Globe and Mail and Toronto Star and a couple other media outlets have a journalism program relationship with the Munk Center, the Munk School. So again, just to recap, the most important school of international affairs in this country is set up by an individual with a major stake in a particular type of Canadian foreign policy and somebody who's an extreme right-wing ideologue. Going elsewhere in the academic world, where do people think the funding came to set up initial international development studies programs at Canadian universities? Any ideas?
Israel.
Not Israel. An arm of Canadian foreign policy. Government element foreign policy. The aid agency, CEDA. Yeah. So CEDA has been, from the get-go, and continues to today, spend lots of money on international development studies. And they provided the initial seed money for most of the early IDS programs, and they continue to provide significant funding. So between 1986 and 2006, CEDA provided $250 million to Canadian universities. Not all of that went to IDS programs, but a lot of it did. Now, CEDA, of course, would be a preferable arm of Canadian foreign policy than the military, but it is still an arm of Canadian foreign policy. And despite, we talk about aid, but in fact, if you look at the history of it, I'm not going to go into detail, we can get into it later on if people want. But if you look at the history of Canadian aid, it's been clearly about two main things. One is about advancing Canadian geostrategic interests, first and foremost. Secondly, about advancing Canadian corporate interests. And CEDA has resisted efforts by universities to have more independent sources of funding. So when universities have pushed to get more neutral avenues of funding for international projects, CEDA's pushed back. So CEDA is not, as an arm of Canadian foreign policy, it's not in the business of funding opposition to Canadian foreign policy. That's not to say that there wouldn't be academics receiving, that you're working in departments that are receiving some CEDA funding that wouldn't be challenging Canadian foreign policy. There are, but at a big picture level, it's an arm of Canadian foreign policy. It's not in the business of funding opposition to Canadian foreign policy. And they also fund a number of the journals, right? A number of the International Development Studies journals are funded by CEDA or IDRC, the International Development Research Center, which is another arm of Canadian aid. And so they've influenced the international discussion, or they've curtailed criticism of Canadian foreign policy through their funding of academic departments. CEDA was also heavily involved in setting up the institution like the North-South Institute. Right? North-South Institute was set up in the mid-70s with financing from CEDA. Pretty explicitly to have an arm's-length organization making the case for increasing the Canadian aid budget. So it's very much an institutional prerogative of CEDA to have an arm's-length organization putting out research calling for increased aid. That was their motivation in setting up the North-South Institute. Other organizations that I go into in a bit of detail in the book, groups like Rights and Democracy, Canadian Institute of International Peace and Security, other sort of influential organizations in sort of ideas around Canadian foreign policy over the past decades. Both those organizations were set up by acts of parliament. They received basically all their funding from the Canadian government. And when the Canadian government decided they no longer wanted those organizations, stopped funding them, they basically disappeared overnight. So give you a sense of the dependence on the Canadian government. The Canadian Aid Agency also spends tens of millions of dollars on what it describes as promotion of development awareness. $47.5 million on that between 2005 and 2008. Over $3.5 million of that money went to articles, film, radio reports about CEDA projects, mostly appearing on major media outlets like CTV, Global, Ottawa Citizen, etc. And a recent example, 2 months ago, the Ottawa Citizen ran a front page story about Canada's role in coming up with the Ebola vaccine. And it said right up top that this reporting was financed by the International Development Research Center, which is, again, an arm of Canadian aid. And basically the reporter the money for the reporter to go to West Africa to cover the story was put up by IDRC. And of course the story portrayed Canada in a very positive light. It's disturbing that the Ottawa Citizen would see no problem with receiving funds from one arm of Canadian foreign policy to cover Canadian foreign policy. It's also, should go without saying, that IDRC and CEDA are not funding reporters to go cover a Canadian mining company destroying a local community's water system in Ecuador, or some other thing that portrays Canadian foreign policy in a negative light. They fund what they think is going to portray their activities positively. During the war in Afghanistan, CEDA had a contract with Le Devoir, the Montreal Daily, to, quote, remind readers of the central role that Afghanistan plays in CEDA's international assistance program. Okay? So during the war in Afghanistan, part of the justification for the war was that we were putting all kinds of money into aid projects. Notably, often discussed, was we were funding schools so now girls could be educated. So that, in my opinion, most of that aid money was really just a PR exercise to justify the military mission. But beyond that, CEDA actually had a contract with a major paper, and maybe with others, to have them cover CEDA's projects, to just further reinforce this emphasis on the aid efforts in Afghanistan. Moving towards a conclusion, one of the rules of Canadian foreign policy that you will not hear mentioned in many other venues than maybe a talk by me, is that the more impoverished a nation the greater the gap is likely to be between what Canadian officials say and do. Okay, so the weaker, poorer a place is, the bigger the lies Canadian officials can tell us about what they're doing. And the main explanation is that, unfortunately, to a large extent, power defines reality. No better example of this than Haiti in the mid-2000s. So our government's involved in plotting the coup, executing the coup militarily, Canadian soldiers involved, backing a coup government responsible for thousands of people being killed. Our aid money is going to pay top officials of that coup government, so CEDA employees of CEDA, or top officials, employees of USAID or ministers in the government. Our aid money is going to supporting a Haitian police force that's going into slum neighborhoods and massacring people. The Sûreté de Québec, RCMP are training that force, backing that force up. That's our aid money going to that. Back at home, so while we're supporting, our aid money is basically supporting the torturers of the majority poor in Haiti. Back at home, politicians are talking about our benevolence. That we're giving more than $100 million in aid to Haiti. This incredible benevolence. And so you ask yourself, how is it possible to have that bigger gap between reality and then the perception, ability to distort things so much? And the main explanation, there are a number, but the main explanation is that what capacity do the victims of Canadian policy in Haiti, the slum dwellers of Port-au-Prince, the peasants, rural areas, what capacity do they have to tell Canadians or the world their version of what Canadian policy in Haiti means, Canadian policy in the country means, versus what capacity does Ottawa, Paris, Washington, the Haitian elite have to tell their version of what's going on? The imbalance of resources is just obviously immense. And so just to give you one sort of example of that imbalance of resources, just before the Aristide government was ousted, the full national budget in Haiti for a government that's highly centralized was just under $300 million US. The PR budget of the Canadian military supersedes that. Right? The Canadian military's PR budget overall is $20 billion, so it would be like 60, 70 times the entire national budget of Haiti, but just the PR budget supersedes it, let alone the Pentagon's PR budget, let alone the French military, State Department, Foreign Affairs Canada, Haitian elite, etc., etc. So it is my contestation that the bias in favor of the corporate / foreign affairs perspective in about Canadian foreign policy among ideological institutions is more extreme than most people, even people who are critical, understand. Partly because, while somebody who may be engaged in Palestine solidarity activism understands there's all this bias in favor of the Israeli perspective in the media, but they understand that partly because they know a lot. They've learned a lot about the Palestinian perspective and what's happened to Palestinians. But there's so many other issues where you might not know much, so it's very difficult to understand just how significant the bias is. And it's hard to know that much about that many different international issues. So the bias is extreme, but it's not a totally enclosed system. First of all, we're allowed to have a meeting like this, so we're not in a totalitarian system. But even within major media outlets, major paper, it's not totally enclosed. And I have some personal experience with that with the Montreal Gazette. And notably, a reporter there named Sue Montgomery. Sue Montgomery was the person that the Gazette sent to Port-au-Prince in the days before the coup, what would turn into the coup. And Sue Montgomery was completely played by Canadian officials and organizations aligned with Canada. She was robbed, and the Canadian ambassador, when she was in Port-au-Prince, she was robbed, and Canadian ambassador told her that it was the Chimère, robbed at gunpoint, not just sort of, whatever, but seriously robbed. And the Canadian ambassador told her it was the Chimère responsible for robbing her. Chimère were purported pro-Aristide thugs. The Canadian ambassador also told her that Aristide had told the Chimère to target international journalists because he wasn't happy with the coverage he was receiving. And he told Sue Montgomery to tell all the international reporters at the Hotel Montana, where most international journalists stay in Port-au-Prince, that the Aristide had given the Chimère the orders to target international journalists. And she would do it. She would actually tell other reporters. So she believed it. And of course, this colored her reporting, which was terrible at the time of the coup. And all this stuff, the story is recounted in a very interesting master's thesis by Isabel MacDonald about who she interviews most of the major Canadian journalists dispatched to Haiti in the time of the 2004 coup. So she interviews people like Neil MacDonald, who makes it very clear that his major source of contacts for stories in Haiti was the Canadian government, notably CIDA. So he says that, makes it pretty clearly, explains that, and other reporters. But anyway, so Sue Montgomery, after doing this terrible coverage in Haiti around the time of the coup, will do a 180-degree turn on her position on what was going on in Haiti. So by the time of the 2006 federal election in this country, she actually writes a column saying that Pierre Pettigrew, the foreign minister, and Denis Coderre, the special representative on Haiti, they should lose their seats in the Montreal area for their role in undermining Haitian democracy. And so Sue Montgomery does this 180-degree turn, partly because with time, she looks back on what she was told and it doesn't really add up. But probably more importantly, because Haiti Action Montreal, a group that I was part of, we publicly criticized her. We sent that to her. That angered her. Also, we organized events. We organized press conferences where we invited her, where we brought up speakers from Haiti, where we put forward a different perspective of what was going on, a more compelling perspective of what was going on. We also put up tens of thousands of Canada out of Haiti stickers all across downtown Montreal, which led directly to newspaper reports. We organized demonstrations. So basically, we put pressure, we put out a different perspective. We also online, we detailed a lot of what was actually going on in Haiti. And I think that's what turned her to shift positions. And because she had become the sort of in-house expert on Haiti within the Montreal Gazette, when she shifted her position, that opened up space at the paper more broadly for Haiti Action Montreal to get some of what we were saying in the Haitian community of Montreal more generally, or the progressive sectors of the Haitian community, to get out some of their version of what was going on in Haiti. Obviously far from what it deserved, right? We still didn't get a full accounting of what Canada's actions in Haiti, but major improvement. Now, really to conclude, the main explanation for why there is the bias in favor of the corporate state position on foreign policy is more extreme than domestic issues, is that there is no countervailing force on foreign policy issues. Right? On domestic issues, there is somewhat of a countervailing force to the corporate perspective, notably labor unions. Right? Labor unions have institutional capacities. They have the combined budget across the country is probably into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Let's just say that the peace movement doesn't quite have that kind of resources. Maybe it might have thousands, or maybe only tens of thousands of dollars. So there really isn't a countervailing force on foreign policy. So on one hand, you have the military with 600 plus employees working on PR. You have foreign affairs with however many hundreds of employees on PR. You have the mining companies with their whole, PR apparatus. And then on the other side, you might have, one employee of the Canadian Peace Movement. You have one or two employees on mining issues, etc. So we need to build up the countervailing force. And one of the things I'm doing as part of this tour is setting up something called the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. There's a sign-up sheet at the back, and I invite people who might want to get our send-outs to put your email down. Basically, all it's going to be initially is just a online hub of critical information on Canadian foreign policy. With time, the hope is to become a full-fledged left-wing foreign policy think tank that produces reports and does media flack and et cetera, et cetera. But initially just a hub of information. But be it setting up a left-wing foreign policy think tank, be it rebuilding the peace movement, the Canadian Peace Alliance, be it building Palestine solidarity, Haiti solidarity, mining and justice solidarity groups, be it supporting the media institutions willing to challenge power on Canadian foreign policy. We need to build that countervailing force on foreign policy issues. So it's not just the hundreds and hundreds of military PR officials and foreign affairs PR officials that get to shape the discussion. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay.